Minneapolis lecture series. My name is Bob Thaman. I am a volunteer board member with Preserve Minneapolis. Preserve Minneapolis promotes and celebrates Minneapolis historic, architectural, and cultural resources through advocacy, education, and public engagement. Many of you know us through our popular summer walking tours. This evening's lecture is the second of 4. Details of the upcoming lectures can be found on our site, preserveminneapolis.org. These lectures are being recorded and archived to help make information about local history and preservation accessible to all in the future. This evening, we welcome Linda Mack, who was the Minneapolis Star-Tribune architectural critic for 21 years. During that time, Linda encountered interesting and sometimes humorous stories, which was going to be tonight's topic. However, we determined that Linda has a much greater and important story to tell. That is how historic preservation revived the Minneapolis and St. Paul riverfronts. Linda interviewed numerous people involved in the redevelopment, and I think you'll find her lecture extremely interesting. Before starting, I ask that you save your questions until the end of the lecture. We will open the chat function at that time for you to enter your questions, and I will ask them to Linda. So now, Preserve Minneapolis warmly welcomes Linda Mack.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thanks everybody for bearing with me in my kind of bait and switch here. I just started to think about the Secret Life of an Architecture Critic is a fun but brief talk that I gave kind of right after I finished my stint at the Star Tribune in 2007. And I started to think about the audience, and I thought, yeah, I think I should do something a little more substantial. And went to my PowerPoint, and here was this PowerPoint that our own Ann Calvert actually helped me with. And it's such a compelling story about historic preservation in Minneapolis. Some of you will know all of it. Some of you will know pieces of it, but it really came out of an oral history project in which I interviewed 29 people who were involved in riverfront revitalization over the course of 30, 40 years. And I think you'll enjoy seeing some of these people and some of the history of the Minneapolis riverfront and how it has been transformed. So, how the Minneapolis riverfront was run and how preservation played a part. A little orientation. Most of you will know the parts of the river, but I just want to, you may know and probably do know that, St. Anthony, where'd it go? Oh, okay. St. Anthony side of the river merged with the Minneapolis side in 1872. This graph shows, what has become parkland, what is housing, what is redeveloped areas, and the public infrastructure. Just a bit of orientation. Take you back to 1963 when the lock and dam were being constructed in order to provide navigation another mile up the Mississippi River. We aren't sure that really ever paid off, but it was a big boondoggle, and we can thank Hubert Humphrey for that, I believe. And this is that, takes you back to that point in time. And here we are in the 70s, the riverfront it was like a post-industrial riverfront. The remnants of the industry were there, the sand and gravel piles, the grain elevators, the infrastructure, but really not much was happening. The mills had long been shut down. So in 1971, the last train left the Milwaukee Road Depot. So that was certainly a notable moment. And in 1978, the last freight train went across the Stone Arch Bridge, and then the last passenger train about 10 years later. And many people tried to get out on the Stone Arch Bridge and walk around, including our dear friend Tom Meyer, as part of his architectural education at the University of Minnesota. Was an attractive nuisance, one might say. So what were the first steps? Fujiya. In 1967, Rico Weston opened Fujiya on the Minneapolis Riverfront. And this is where I would love if I could ask how many of you, went there and experienced it. She had a small restaurant downtown. She wanted to be on the river. She saw the river as a magical place for Japanese people, and she figured it would be even for us Minneapolitans. And so most people, it's many people's first experience with ethnic dining, as well as their first experience at the river. And that was one of the fun things in these oral history interviews. So many people said, yeah, I first went to the river, to go to Fujiya. Another pioneer was Peter Hall, and he opened his Prochna on Main in 1969. He had gone to 70 different meetings to kind of beg, persuade people to give him money to buy it. He needed $10,000. And finally, Lou Zelli actually gave him $20,000, and he opened Prochna on Main. And again, what a neat spot. It's still there. At that point, it was the restaurant and bar down below, and then Peter Hall and his wife and child lived up above, and there was really nothing else down there. Across the river, Peter was also fascinated by the flour mills, and we see I'm gonna say, if I can do a cursor here, whoops, that didn't do it. So the building with the funny stairway going up was where Peter Hall, again, later on, sort of installed himself. He lived there. He had his architectural studio a floor down, and they said the dog lived a floor up. So, and it had been abandoned by the General Mills and was vacant. And his architectural firm included Tom Meyer there with the big glasses and all the hair, and Sarah Suzanka on the far left, who became famous later for the Not So Big House series. And they donned the flour miller's outfits that had been hanging on the wall there, and had this picture taken, quite fun. Peter Hall is the one with all the mustache there. Across the river again, on the east bank, Louis Zelli on the left, and his friend Henry Blodgett, kind of the financial guy, are in the basement of St. Anthony, Maine, before that was renovated. And Peter Hall really said, so Lou Zelli happened to own these buildings because his family was involved with the early transportation company, the bus company, and somehow ended up with a lot of property over there. So Peter Hall said, you need to do something with these and buy some more of the buildings so you can see Prochna there by itself. And Louis Zelli went after it. He had help from architect Benjamin Thompson, famous for Quincy Hall in Boston, who was a childhood friend of Lou Zelli's. This is all a St. Paul Academy kind of connection here. And he worked on this first building, the first phase of St. Anthony, Maine, which is the Salisbury Mattress Factory. And you can see, it's a charming spot. And that was, again, one of our first really great success stories on the riverfront. Later on, there was another phase where new buildings were built in between the older buildings. MS&R were the architects on that. And, you know, we know now the Astor Cafe is down there and the cinema, and it's just a lovely, appealing part of the city. 1978, St. Anthony Falls discovered. It was put out by the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Board. It was the first time that it was a collection that really said how many historic resources are in this area. And McDonald and Mack were involved in that architectural survey. So that was a very notable publication. Nicollet Island, you know, what an incredible place. One of the really only populated islands in the whole Mississippi River. Well, it was a pretty darn quiet place in, in the 1960s and 70s. Phyllis Kahn, who was a longtime resident, said first time she ended up there, she said, if I'd been taken by boat and ended up here, I would have thought I was in a very remote place. And it still has some of that rural charm, but it was very derelict and needed help. Of course, the powers that be came up with a plan with the help of Nicollet Island de La Salle high school students. And of course, you can always see there's a stadium. There's always a stadium, right? And a highway coming through it. So that was their idea for redoing Nicollet Island. Thank heavens that didn't happen. And one reason it didn't was this fellow, John Chaffee, probably a name nobody knows, but he was a resident and he was a carpenter. And he and what was called the Project Area Committee, because it was an urban renewal area, lobbied and lobbied and lobbied and said, we need to keep the houses, we need to renovate the houses, and we need to preserve the history. And one of the really incredible saves was the Grove Street Flats, which was truly falling down. And developer John Kerwin managed to pry the property from the hands of Harry Lerner, publisher who owned it. And on the day that the city council was going to vote to have it demolished, he came in and before the meeting, he actually had put on the city council members' desks the property transfer that proved he owned it, and he indeed did get it renovated. And the other houses were renovated too, many by the people who lived there, and other houses were moved in from places, and some new houses were built, but in the style that made them compatible. And that was due to this is just to show that kind of the rural character was really kept. And there was an incredible scene at one of the meetings where the housing, so the Minneapolis Community Development Housing Agency wanted housing there. The park board wanted to preserve it as a park. And after shouting matches and so forth, they met at Don Fraser's house, and a compromise was negotiated that said the park board would own the land, the Minneapolis Community Development Agency would help people get money, and they would commit to renovating, and so the housing would be built as well. Nearby, we have River Place going up. And I'm sure some of you remember the thrilling atrium and the candle shops and so forth. I have to note that this was my first fundraising effort to try to stop River Place. Kathy O'Brien and I held a fundraiser and raised $800 to help the lawsuit to stop River Place. We were not successful, obviously. So, you know, here was a different scale on the Minneapolis Riverfront. And, you know, a lot of people have enjoyed living there. And it was supposed to be the recreation of a Tuscan hill town. I never quite got that. And the steps leading up to Our Lady of Lourdes Church were supposed to be reminiscent of the Spanish Steps. And I never quite got that either. So, but it was done, and it was done because Lou DeMars pulled in his buddy and fellow De La Salle High School graduate, Bob Boisclair, who's a developer, and they worked at it and got a lot of city money, a lot of subsidy, and made it happen. And Father Moss, who was the of Our Lady of Lourdes Church, I guess was very good at wringing money out of his former students. So he got a lot of money to tuck point the church. He said, you know, the construction just messed everything up. So Bobby Boisclair had to pay up. Back on the West Bank, the Crown Roller Mill burned down. Well, it didn't burn down, it burned in 1983. And Kit Richardson saw it and called his partner Pete Gelser, and they somehow ran down there and tried to, you know, stop the firemen from destroying it all. And Bob Roscoe and Kathy O'Brien and Tony Scallon all helped that process, and the city council said, yeah, okay, we'll keep it and we'll see that it is renovated. So it was, and it's a little bit of a set piece of history, but it's been part of that riverfront landscape. The Minneapolis Community Development Agency office there, and Calvert's office was in there, and AA Minnesota moved in a few years ago, and it's certainly been a functional part of that riverfront. And but the big challenge was the Milwaukee Road Depot. So you may remember that date, 1971, the last train leaves. And here people are looking at the waiting room, and it truly was a waiting game. There were just maybe 14 different development proposals. Some of them were kind of practical, like this one, over the years, and some of them were not so practical. This was Wisconsin developer Harry Worth and the Pei property developers. So this Ting Pei, I am Pei's son, came, and they were proposing that it become a World Trade Center and made, you know, major high rises. Funny that, well, that didn't happen, but Norman Kerr, a local guy, thought it should be a casino, and that didn't happen. And there were many other ideas that didn't have. One that I was reviewing was bike parking, and I thought, well, maybe that's what today that would be probably the best thing, right? Well, what did happen was River West was built on the riverfront, blocking everything behind it from a river view. A very unfortunate, you know, there were guidelines, but the city council voted to ignore them, and this went up again. Many people enjoy the riverfront view. And the West River Parkway went in. Oh, what a boon that was. I mean, can you imagine the city without the West River Parkway? And this is in the 1980s, and there was a plan that, you know, it's like, where is it going to go? The first idea was it would be inland and not on the river. Well, not a good idea. So the city actually, the park board, I think, negotiated a swap with Glacier Park, which owned this land, the old railroad company, and they swapped 16 acres for land up where the Star Tribune printing plant is, and enabled the park board to put in the West River Parkway. Just a huge amenity. Unfortunately, it took parking for Fujiya, and that really closed it down. Reiko Weston died soon after, and this incredible place was closed for years and vacant. Very sad. then there was the fire, the big fire in the Washburn Crosby Mill. And this time, Nina Archibald was the one who called Sharon Sales Belton right away and said, you know, tell the firemen to save as much as they can, which is tricky. You got to put out the fire, but it was full of this incredible milling machinery and infrastructure that never could be recreated. And so it took a long time for this to get cleaned up and rebuilt. Tom Meyer, we must give a lot of credit to. He made a model of how it could be used in a redevelopment and just took that all around. And Nina Archibald worked with him. And what happened was the Mill City Museum. So the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Zone was an area that was designated to have preservation guidelines to really highlight history. And the motto, this came out of the Minneapolis Riverfront board, and the motto was good business, good history, good recreation. Well, what could be better than the Stone Arch Bridge reopening in 1994? When you talk about good recreation, that has just been a lifeblood. And it was quite a save because it had been bought by the Hennepin County Railroad Authority, and they were hanging on to it for future light rail. And John Darris, one of the Hennepin County commissioners, once said, don't let people walk on it because we'll never get it back. Well, he was certainly right, wasn't he? And there was a sort of a tricky transfer of the property from the Hennepin County Railroad Authority to the state at the state legislature at the very end of one session. And that's how this place became what it is today. And it's so interesting because, of course, now it's going to be closed to be tuck pointed and shored up, which it needs to be. And it's seen as a civic crisis because people won't be able to use it and do that wonderful loop in the river and enjoy the river in such an intimate way. So North Star Blankets was the first of the condo developments. Mayor Sharon Sales Belton convinced Brighton Development's Peggy Lucas to do some Chicago-style lofts in 1999. Pretty adventuresome, and the starting price for a condo there was $99,000. You could wish for that now, I think, but. And then we get back to the depot, still sitting vacant, and it went through all these efforts, and finally, Sharon Sales Belton kind of takes credit for pulling in Gary Holmes of CSM Corporation, and Ann Calvert notes that finally the Minneapolis Community Development Agency actually bought the property, I think out of bankruptcy, and at a low enough price that it made it possible to have a development. And there were improvements in the way that pollution removal was handled, and which made a huge difference because you can imagine the pollution that was in this area from both the trains and other industrial development. Milgreens Park, 1987, opened, and we must credit Bob Matson, a park board planner who had gone to school at Harvard and saw all the historic renovation there, Quincy Market and so forth. And he had this vision that you could actually make a park out of the ruins of the milling industry that once made Minneapolis the milling capital of the world. And indeed, it happened. And it was just thrilling to see this landscape emerge. Here are some bridge pillars, and you see the tail races down below. and the tunnels where the water would come out. It'd be brought in up above and brought down. And these images really matched up with images that we had from the construction of the tail races. So it's really an incredible amenity. And then we had the stone arch lofts, just a super design by Paul Madsen of a new building within this historic context of the recycled mills. And it's still a very Tony wonderful housing complex, and just so well done to fit in but not be pandering to history. Julie Snow did a marvelous job also on the Humboldt lofts down the block. You see the arched windows of the old section, and then she designed this new section. So we have the condos above and the restaurant below. And again, saving history and moving forward, as happened finally with the Washburn Crosby Mill and the courtyard and the Mill City Museum and those businesses that actually became kind of a condo in here with offices, and it's just a really beautiful addition to the city. A beautiful ruin. It's been a place for opera and weddings and all sorts of celebrations. And this was the Washburn Lofts, which maybe is the toniest of all of them. And it finally became this full block condos, and they're quite stunning. So what an incredible part of the city. 2nd Avenue South is a kind of art entertainment restaurant area. Still needs trees, but that evidently is not going to happen now. We have bike paths instead. And remember the plank road down on the river, which they finally had to replace. It wasn't safe. And then the big kahuna, the Guthrie. So in about 2000, the Guthrie was decided, it needed new quarters. And the site had been cleared for a baseball stadium. And the Guthrie board looked all around and decided they would build here. And this is John Duval's design with the cantilever, which I like because it just provides a wonderful view of the riverfront. Unbelievably expensive to build this thing, but there you go. And we all know it as blue, but when it was unveiled, it was actually yellow. He thought that would be a good color, kind of wheat, Midwestern agriculture. And, of course, we're at the big unveiling party, but the Guthrie board had already said, no yellow. So he went to blue. He likes dark things. And that is certainly a part of the riverfront landscape now. This window, which is in that cantilever, actually opens. It sort of pushes down and out. And I've seen it once when John Duval gave the tour, and the Guthrie people will not do it ever again. We don't know what it costs to do that. He thought it would be really cool if you could open it up and feel the out of doors. But the Guthrie people do not think that is a good idea. But it does frame the riverfront beautifully. It frames the history, and created a new space, this Chicago Avenue Plaza, where the farmers market is. It's marvelous. And it's just so many people populate the riverfront, enjoy the riverfront. It still has kept its historic charm. The revival continued with the Pillsbury A Mill, which is now Artists Lofts. And then, Awamni and the Waterfront Park replaced finally Fujiya, and have brought new completion to that West Bank riverfront. And so it's a marvelous place. It's an unusual place. It's a Minneapolis unique place. And we really have historic preservation and great follow through by city staff and some through many mayoral transitions to make this happen. So that's it. And here's if anybody's interested, the information on the Oral History Project, which has, as I said, 26 oral history interviews. So a lot of good material. And this is just a bit of it. So I'm happy to take questions. And if we want to get rid of the screen, do that. Bob, I think you're muted.
If someone would like to ask a question now, please do so, and we'll get it to Linda.
There's some in the chat. Are we able to unmute people and have a conversation?
I don't know on that. There was one, let's see if Sally has one, or did Sally have a question? I don't think so.
Well, I can check the chat if you like.
This is Tom, George.
There's Tom.
Hey, Linda, how you doing?
Good.
I think you know how I like to talk, so I didn't want to write it all out in the chat. but I'm so curious about. Well, I love historic preservation. I live in the Washburn Fair Oaks Historic District. And my latest thing is trying to get the state of Minnesota to give tax credits for homeowners of historic properties. We don't have that.
No, we don't. Yeah.
And Wisconsin and quite a few other states have it. So anyway, I know this is a little off the topic, but I was curious to see all the homeowners on Nicollet Island. And then it was the Minneapolis Community Development Agency. Is that what it was? Do you have any idea how the financing worked for that? I mean, did they get big grants or forgivable loans, or what was?
Well, let's see. Ann Calvert might know more about that than I do. I know they had to commit to renovating, a particular place, and then I think there was money through urban renewal funds, but I guess I don't know the details of it any more than that.
Well, it's just
there was some public financing, but people had to put in a lot of sweat equity, I believe.
Yeah, that happened in our neighborhood too. There's a big need for homeowners because it's so expensive. And I'm sure you're aware that the tax credits got extended, I think it was this year, for commercial property, historic. So that's a huge boon. Anyway, that's my latest thing. And I'm I just hope that either Minneapolis or the state can recognize that for all the other historic property and neighborhood and districts in the state.
Well, it would be great because, getting your building listed, your house listed on the local register is a bit of a burden as well as an honor. And if there were some positive aspect to it, like a tax credit, it would be very good. I don't know if we'll get it in our current climate, however.
Yeah. Anyway, I loved your presentation. It's so interesting. I mean, I grew up with all that happening.
Yeah.
And so it was very good, Linda. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
I have a question, Linda, which was some of the earlier photos you were showing of some of the buildings decaying and everything. how long of a time span was it between, let's say, when things really were going down until they started picking up? Was it 10 years or 20 or 5 or?
Oh gosh, I would have to look into that to answer that very correctly. Everything, took seemed to take a long time. I think maybe Nicollet Island in particular, I mean, I would sort of imagine a 10-year kind of process. And it took them a while to come up with the compromise, and then, things did move forward. But these city building takes time. So this was really, this was covering 30 to 40 years of redevelopment.
Okay. We have a question from Jessica, and she said, did she understand correctly that all of the condos around the Washburn Mill were in place before the Guthrie was built?
I'd have to sort of check that. They were pretty well there, yes. And I don't have to, Anne knows everything. I should ask Anne. So there was, I think Mill City Museum, certainly opened before the Guthrie was done. It was sort of like the Guthrie was the icing on the cake in a lot of ways. The board could see that it was a growing area. It was a area where, maybe even some of their supporters were living. And as they looked around the city for a place to move from where they were, over by the Walker Art Center, it's still, if you looked at it at that point, it was all, there were big grain elevators and parking lots, no streets to the east of where the Guthrie is now. It was just really undeveloped. And so you think about all the infrastructure that had to go in. Some of those grain elevators were torn down, the big complex, and then they had to put streets in. There was an incredible amount of industrial pollution that had to be cleaned up. And so I always saw the Guthrie as kind of following the crowd rather than leading the crowd. And then it was like Gold Medal Park, which is again to the east of that, was just truly, the final wonderful spot.
We have another question from Jane, and she asked, what was the building that is now the pavilion on Nicollet Island?
That was a lumber company, I believe. And so there was an amphitheater across from it, and that was one of the earliest parts of the park board development. And that Nicollet Island Inn was really early on. I know the couple that opened that, and the rest of Nicollet Island at that point was a lot of what they call now single room occupancy housing. And the bums had kind of been moved from the Gateway area to Nicollet Island. So that complex is really a lovely one still. We have the pavilion, they have a lot of nice events there, but the amphitheater is unused at this point. Yeah.
The theater that's on Main, that was a later addition, wasn't it? I mean, that's not old.
Yeah, that was part of the third phase, right? But yeah, again, if you look at the new buildings, the old buildings, it's really a beautifully designed. It doesn't hurt you to see what's new there with the old at all. It's very well done.
What are they doing with the where the shops used to be? All of when it originally opened, River Place and everything. What is that? What has become of that? Or
Well, it was office space. I don't know what's there now. You remember there was a Japanese restaurant for a long time because it was the Japanese who finally funded a big part of it. So they had to have a Japanese restaurant. Chronic has an answer.
We have a possible answer for Jane from Richard. It says the big pavilion was part of the W.S. Knott Company. They had a large group of buildings on the downstream end of Nicollet Island.
Thank you, Dick.
I guess we're getting towards the end of the of today's lecture, and there is a question that we might all be interested in, which is from the original subject, and that is, what is the tallest building downtown?
Well, so you might think that IDS Center is the tallest building. It's always been said that it's the tallest building, right? Well, when First Bank Place was built, and at their press conference announcing the design, they made a big point about how it will be 4 feet shorter than IDS because IDS is the queen of the skyline, right? But the guys who were constructing it with Opus Construction thought that was ridiculous. And so as they were ordering steel for that crown, they added, in their order, they added 10 feet to that. And so the crown actually extended to a point that was higher than the IDS. And this became kind of an urban legend. It wasn't widely known, but in the this website, emporus.com, that ranks buildings, you know, suddenly First Bank Place ends up as the tallest building, because if you measure it, it was. But then a few years later, strangely enough, IDS ends up back as the tallest building. And they had decided that they were going to count the antenna on top of the building, which I think is a bit, anyway. So it is now, again, the tallest building.
Yeah.
So I found out about this as I had written an obit for about Philip Johnson, and got a call from, you know, the people who knew about the urban legend and said, you know, IDS isn't the tallest. This is what happened, and they fessed up. So
do you think that they will keep the IDS will always be kind of the center, if you want to call it, the skyline? You think it'll probably stay?
Probably at this time. Are we going to see any more office towers built? I don't know.
That's a good point.
Maybe residential.
Yeah, we have another question from Jessica. And she writes, were the rails that border the wood planks between the Mill City Museum and the river always in that location and served a purpose, or were they moved there as a design feature?
Oh, wow. I don't think I can answer that. I think they would have been put in as part of the plank road.
Yes, they were. This is Ann.
Yeah, because and I think
rail was up a layer, and that was a wood plank road over the canal that's still in existence underneath.
Yeah.
So they just used the rail to demark the road from the walk area.
Yeah. I think they had to put them in as a safety measure.
Okay. Are there any other questions from anyone?
I would just like to highlight again, not only Ann Calvert, but Bob Matson from the Park Board, city planners. There was this incredible interagency staff group that worked on most of what I talked about, and especially on the West Bank. And there was this vision, and they carried it through. Very, you know, different mayors came and went, and there's still this vision of how the riverfront would be redeveloped. And we just all in Minneapolis and throughout the state owe them a great debt of thanks.
There was a lot of interviews that went into tonight's presentation, actually, over the years, if as I understand, with all of your research and everything.
Yes, I did 26 interviews of 29 people in 2008 and 9, and those are all at the Minnesota Historical Society. So, you know, Scott Anfinson, who was the state archaeologist, and Betsy Dorman, who was the head of the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Board, and Nina Archibald, and John Chaffee, the guy on Nicollet Island, and it's good stuff.
If there are no other questions, I would like to thank everyone tonight for attending, and a heartfelt thank you to Linda. If you would like to consider becoming involved with Preserve Minneapolis as a board member or volunteer, please contact us at preserveminneapolis.org. Thank you very much, and this concludes tonight's lecture.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Jen, and thank you, Preserve Minneapolis. Thanks.